Welcome to the Cannabis Innovators Show. My name is Michelle Holliday. Today we have an important and content-rich interview about this serious aspect of the legislation process in the United States and worldwide. Before we turn to our great guest today, I want to mention our previous show with Kim Garrity, co-founder of Madam Munchie, which will be very fun to grab a cup of coffee, relax, and listen to if you're a cannabis consumer and advocate. Also, from an investor's perspective, it will give an idea of what's working. Today we have with us Mr. Keith Stroup. Keith is a Washington, D.C. based attorney and founder of NORML. Keith, thank you so much for being here on the Cannabis Innovators Show. How are you today?
I'm fine, and thank you for inviting me, Michelle.
You know, Keith, I interviewed Randy Shipley a few weeks ago, the president of the Marijuana International Corporation and the founder of the Cannabis Business Expos, and he spoke very highly of you because of your extensive knowledge of the marijuana industry.
He's a very generous man. I have spoken at, I guess it was the expo he held in San Diego last year. He's been a generous supporter of NORML, and obviously, you know, some people in the industry are sensitive to the fact that but for the good work of a lot of dedicated people over the last 4 decades, there wouldn't be a marijuana industry today. And Randy is one of those people that understands that, and he's been very generous both financially and otherwise.
Wonderful. You know, I want to start off with the background of cannabis throughout history, especially American history. When was it made illegal and why? In doing my own research, even George Washington grew hemp. My question is, what happened to change that?
Well, you're right, and so did Thomas Jefferson, by the way, just for a little historical perspective. Now, there's no indication that they grew high THC marijuana for smoking purposes. It was used for industrial cords. They made rope out of it, and they made cloth out of it. But both of them, in fact, raised cannabis, and today it's illegal to do it in this country unless, in fact, it's part of a authorized research project associated with a state university. But the easy answer to your question, marijuana first became illegal on the federal level in 1937, but by then there had been a number of states, I think 10 or 12, that had already passed anti-marijuana laws. And what they were, almost no one in America knew what marijuana was. I mean, most Americans had not even heard of it. But at the end of alcohol prohibition, one of the top agents, alcohol prohibition agents, was named as the director of the new, in 32, I believe, Bureau of Narcotics. And over the next 5 years, he orchestrated an enormous misinformation campaign, and it was racist and it was bigoted. It basically focused on the fact that the most people who used marijuana in this country at that time were either Mexican migrant workers, and they certainly didn't have any political clout and weren't held in very high regard, or they were black musicians, mostly coming out of New Orleans, but eventually that whole jazz tradition moved up the Mississippi River to St. Louis and to Chicago and to New York. And so the only thing most Americans knew about marijuana was that they were told it was something used by blacks and Hispanic migrant workers, neither group of which they cared much about, and they were told that it would take an ordinary individual and turn him into a violent criminal to axe murder. One famous case used by Anslinger when the law was being considered was he claimed that someone had smoked a marijuana cigarette and then had taken an axe and murdered, I don't know, a family of 5, I think it was. And another allegation that was fairly prominent back then, to show you the racist side of it, the allegation was that if you smoked marijuana, it made white women want to have sex with black men. Well, you can imagine in the 1930s, that was a frightening thought for traditional Americans. So marijuana prohibition was passed with very little debate in Congress and with very little fanfare. It was simply the head of the Bureau of Narcotics needed to make marijuana legal, so he had a campaign he could run and get bigger budgets and show how important he was. It was that sort of bureaucratic growth that we all get accustomed to. So it grew out of ignorance and racism, I would say.
Wow. So in the process of legalizing cannabis, from the approval surveys from people across the country, they point to the fact that the true momentum by the general public is to legalize marijuana. What would be the full process of making cannabis legal from start to finish? If a state were to begin that process today, what needs to occur?
Well, you simply have to go through a regulatory process, and generally the state legislature, or if it's done by voter initiative, the language of the initiative, assigns a responsibility to develop specific regulations to a particular state agency. In the better instances, it goes to a Department of Health or something like that. But in some of the instances, it's actually done by a law enforcement agency because they also sometimes control alcohol and tobacco. So you have to have a period of time for the state to devise regulations, for example, to indicate who qualifies to apply for a license to commercially grow marijuana and who qualifies for a license to commercially sell marijuana. When you end prohibition, what you're doing is you're first off, you stop the arrest of right now more than 600,000 Americans a year. So it's a good step in that sense as well as an expression of personal freedom that it's just none of the government's business. But you also, one of the advantages is you bring it above ground where you regulate the market. You require age controls. It's much more difficult for adolescents to buy alcohol in this country, in most states, than it is marijuana, because with alcohol, they have an age limitation. They have to get a fake ID or have an older friend buy it for them. And while we all know that sometimes happens, it also dissuades a lot of teenagers who would like to buy some alcohol and they can't. Well, when you have a black market, no one asks for an ID. They don't care how old or young you are. So the advantages of legalization include the fact that you have a legally regulated market with age controls, and from the consumer standpoint, we want our marijuana tested by a laboratory. We want to make sure there are no dangerous molds or pesticides in that marijuana, and we want to make sure the labeling is accurate. In particular, consumers need to know the level of the THC and probably the CBD, at least those two. And as the research moves us forward, we probably also will want to have the major terpenoids listed on the packaging as well. But you can't do those kinds of basic consumer protections as long as you're dealing with the black market.
Well, it all seems very logical, Keith. I mean, lower crime rates, increased job creation, higher state taxes, people healing themselves by using the medicinal marijuana, and just feeling that you live in a free country with the use of recreational marijuana. But what took so long? Why has the government allowed cigarettes and alcohol, but not marijuana, which is much less harmful?
Well, no doubt about that conclusion. Alcohol and tobacco are dangerous drugs for sure. I don't think they ought to be treated as a crime. I think adults ought to make their own decision as to whether they want to use those drugs based on honest, accurate information. But we know, for example, that something like 100,000 people die a year from excess alcohol, and that's not including the wrecks on the highway. I mean, people who simply drink too much alcohol and die from a respiratory failure. You simply can't die from a marijuana overdose. It's impossible. It's never happened in the history of mankind. So while there are always certain responsibilities, if you're going to be a marijuana smoker, you want to use marijuana responsibly. But when we started NORML, there was not even the concept of responsible marijuana smoking. Only 12% of the American public supported the legalization of marijuana in 1969, which is when the Gallup polling organization took their first question. That's the first time they'd ever asked the public how many of them favored legalizing marijuana. Before that, they thought it wasn't even important enough to ask. Well, when you say, why did it take so long? Partly it's because marijuana had been stigmatized. It was considered a terribly dangerous drug. And as I mentioned, it had racist overtones and absurd allegations that it turned ordinary people into violent criminals. So we had a lot of re-education to do, and that takes time. But over time, we've seen that 12% support, 88% of the public were against us. We finally, about 5 years ago, reached a point where We had 50% of the country now saying they supported full legalization. And today we have, I think, more than 4 or 5 national surveys, including Gallup, that show at least 60% of the public, 6 out of 10, now support ending marijuana prohibition and adopting a system of regulation and taxation. About 90%, by the way, now support the medical use of marijuana. So the reason it has taken us so long is because we had to re-educate the majority of the Americans about the relative safety of marijuana smoking. We have finally done that, I'm happy to say. So I think there's no turning back, but we still have a lot of work to do. You know, we still, as I say, 600,000 Americans are still arrested every year in this country. So until we stop the practice of treating marijuana smokers like criminals, we can't even begin to deal with the issues of consumer safety.
How is the fact that Canada is pushing hard for legalization affecting U.S. politicians, if at all?
Oh, I think it does indeed. It's reaffirming. In other words, obviously when Colorado and Washington, those brave souls were the first ones out of the box to adopt legalization. And keep in mind, they did it by voter initiative. In other words, the voters are ahead of our elected officials on this issue. And that's generally the case when you're dealing with controversial social issues. So for those first 8 states that have legalized marijuana, it's all been done by voter initiative. We're just about right now to see if the governor in Vermont is going to sign what is the first full legalization bill to be approved by a state legislature. But I think it's always reinforcing to elected officials if they see other states, other cities, other countries in particular, going in the same direction we're going. If we're the only people moving towards legalizing marijuana and everybody else is still treating it like a terribly dangerous drug, obviously that's a drag on our political momentum. In fact, right now it's quite the contrary. There are countries all over the world that are moving towards or adopting some version of marijuana legalization. And the reason they're doing it primarily is because once we started winning in the U.S., the federal U.S. government couldn't threaten to cut off their trade or otherwise reprimand countries that might move in the direction. You know, Jamaica's talked about legalizing marijuana for years. They're finally doing it. But every time they got close to it before, they were threatened with economic sanctions by the U.S. government. Well, we can't threaten people now because we're adopting the same policy ourselves.
I'm sure as an attorney and as founder of NORML, you get to see many companies that are pre-IPO before they go public. How serious is this business right now, in your opinion? And is big venture capital funds coming in? What can we expect in the U.S. over the coming years?
The estimated size of the market right now is $6 billion a year, and that's a pretty sizable market. But once California comes online next year, they're estimated to have a $6 billion market themselves. So the national market's going to double overnight, basically. So it's an incredible, exhilarating, exciting time to see an entire new industry started from scratch. And a lot of people that used to work in the industry when it was illegal, when it was underground, have managed to come above ground now, and they've managed to find a niche in that new legal market. And I'm delighted to see that. What I would say about the current industry is this. Because of the Trump administration and because of the threat that Attorney General Jeff Sessions just couldn't find a way to throw a monkey wrench into this newly legal marijuana market, if I were thinking about investing my own money in the market right now, I simply wouldn't do it. I would wait to see how Trump is going to play out, how his policies are going to play out. If he does the smart thing and leaves the states alone for a few months, then I think it's time for the capital to jump back in and let's expand the market. Now, as to the public stocks, the penny stocks and stuff that have been started, that's pretty iffy stuff. If you're talking about serious investments, I think it's almost too early. I think if I were wanting to get into the marijuana industry on the financial side right now and you had resources, join one of those venture capital groups. And there are a handful of them out there that are looking at specific marijuana-related projects in the states where it's legal and making selected investments. I think that's probably where I would put my money. I happen to be a public interest lawyer, so that's not a problem.
Now, what can we expect in the United States in the coming 2 to 3 years in regards to investments, companies launching, entrepreneurship?
I think people sometimes forget that we have 50 states, but one of them has something like 13 or 14% of our entire population, and that's California. So once California comes online, the green rush is going to even be kicked up to a higher gear. And it's been pretty enthusiastic new market for a number of years now. And the governor of Colorado, for example, was never a supporter of legalization when we were getting it passed. And even for the first couple of years, he now says he acknowledges it's really been good for the state and it's created tens of thousands of new jobs. Well, you're going to have tens of thousands of new jobs just next year in California alone. And you're going to have them in Nevada, and you're going to have them in Maine and in Massachusetts, because all of those new state laws come online. I also think we will add another 4 or 5 states to the list of states that have totally legalized marijuana within the next 4 or 5 years. We will do a couple probably by voter initiative, but I think we're now at the point, as we demonstrated in Vermont, where we can begin to win those battles through the state legislatures. And that's important because 24 of the states do not offer the voter initiative option to change public policy. You have to work through the state legislature. But we're just about at the point where we can win those battles now. So I think the next few years we'll have largely a state-based strategy, because under President Trump and Jeff Sessions, I think we're kind of beating our head against a wall to think that we're going to make too much progress in Washington. We'll continue to work. We'll continue to get additional co-sponsors on our legislation. But right now, frankly, the Republicans won't even allow us to have a hearing on any of our legislation, let alone a vote. So nothing significant is going to happen federally. So for the next few years, we'll continue to make progress on the state level.
Now, what will it take for cannabis companies right now to become more profitable?
Well, the major challenge that state legal, state compliant cannabis companies have right now is because of a rather obscure provisions, 280E it's called, in the Internal Revenue Code. They are not allowed to take expenses off of their income before they pay their taxes. Now, they are allowed to take a few limited expenses, but not the major expenses. And the result is that while most companies might pay a 30% tax rate or something, a lot of marijuana industry companies pay 75, 80% tax, federal tax. So you can imagine that it's a challenge to run a successful business anyway. And keep in mind that even in this new green rush industry, there's a lot of competition out there. So it's not like you can just charge anything you want, because if the neighbor down the street is charging less, before long people are going to find out about that. So there's a market pressure that comes to bear there. But when you can't write off your deductions, obviously, you're probably not going to show a profit. So I think for some of these, they probably are absorbing losses for a few years, presuming they will eventually get that 280E fixed. And there is a bill pending in Congress, by the way. A number of members of Congress recognize that's idiotic. For example, marijuana businesses also generally are not allowed to have a bank account. Banks are afraid to deal with them and can't take credit cards. Now, can you imagine doing a business where you're bringing in tens of thousands of dollars a day sometimes, but you don't have a bank account? They have to have a Brinks truck come at the end of the day to pick up their proceeds and put them in a safe someplace. I mean, it's just idiotic stepping stones that should be removed and taken out of the way. And they will be, by the way. But again, that's one of those small areas where we might actually make some progress even under Trump. I think enough the Republican base in Congress understands the unfairness of that, so that we might be able to see some improvement in those business decisions over the next year or two. Most people who work on ending prohibition and trying to get systems to regulate tax marijuana, we would like to see the industry focused more towards the small grower and more like the wine industry, less like the big alcohol or tobacco industry. And the big fear of a lot of people who cultivate marijuana and have for years, like in Northern California, their fear is that there's going to be some big major, P. Lorillard company come in and take over the industry. So, it'll be interesting to see how that works out. But those battles will be fought over the next few years in each of those states.
Wow, it's an amazing time. Now, Keith, how exactly did NORML start, and what exactly does it do?
Well, a little personal, if I may here. I came through law school at the heart of the anti-Vietnam movement and the Vietnam War, and I was a draft evader. I was worried about being drafted and killed in Vietnam, and I didn't understand the war and wasn't intending to be killed over there. So, at any event, I was offered a chance to go to Canada, but I wasn't sure if I'd ever be allowed back in the country. There were other things that were considered. But I finally, with the help of some Lawyers Guild lawyers that were helping draft evaders, they got me what was called a critical skills deferment. I had been hired right out of law school, Georgetown. I'd been hired by the National Commission on Product Safety. It was a presidential commission, but it was an outgrowth of the work of Ralph Nader. And for the next 2 years, instead of being over in Vietnam, I worked in downtown Washington, but I got to see the king of public interest law. I got to see Ralph Nader and how he used his law degree and the skills he learned in law school, but instead of using them to get rich or to help individual clients, he's using them to impact public policy. He was focused on product safety and auto safety to begin with. I started smoking marijuana when I was a freshman at Georgetown in 1965. So by the time I graduated law school, the issue I cared about was legalizing marijuana. So as a result of that anti-war work that sort of radicalized my politics and the chance to work around Ralph Nader for a couple of years, when the commission came to an end, I was too old to be drafted. So I thought, well, let's start NORML and let's legalize marijuana. Now, again, I at the time thought it might take us 10 years. And of course, that's been 45 years ago. So I guess I was a little optimistic, but
Now, what exactly does NORML do? I know that it's a nationwide organization.
Yes, we actually have NORML groups in a dozen foreign countries as well. But what we all share, we're consumer advocates. In the end, what we're trying to do, marijuana smokers want what consumers want in most other areas. They want a product that's high quality, convenient, safe, and affordable. Those same kind of things that you want if you're buying a TV or buying an appliance. So we have groups in every state, and in fact, in many states, we have several local groups or state college groups, etc. And their job is to organize grassroots support so that their state and federal elected officials understand that a majority of their constituents no longer support the war on marijuana smokers. They want to end it. But they won't believe that unless they hear from people from their district. So our time is spent sometimes drafting legislation to help our friends in the state or federal legislature, but oftentimes building grassroots support, holding lobby days. They just had a big one in Texas, and we've had several of them. We have our national one coming up in September. But the idea is we have enough people, not who smoke marijuana, by the way. Only about 14% of the population, adult population, smoke marijuana. But as I mentioned earlier, because we now enjoy the support of a majority of the non-smokers, we have nationwide 60% support. So we have enough political support to win this issue, but we have to organize our supporters better than they are today. But, that takes time, and we're making progress every year. So that's sort of what NORML is. NORML is a place where the media contact us if they're going to do a story on marijuana and they want some facts, or they go to our website. Or if there's a group of activists in Idaho that decide they want to become more active and legalize marijuana in Idaho, oftentimes they come to NORML and ask if they can set up a NORML chapter. And so we help them do that and get up to speed. We try to be the voice of the responsible marijuana smoker.
I see. Excellent. Now, in closing, Keith, As we're recording this show, one of Portfolio Wealth Global's founders is currently in Washington, D.C. to attend a major marijuana conference. And it seems that on the federal level, legalization is sort of, it's detached from the rest of the country's reality, right? They're having a major cannabis convention in the same area that Congress meets every day, but they keep the substance illegal on a federal level.
Well, but let me tell you, Michelle, it's even more shocking than that. Washington, D.C. is like a city. It's not a state. We have our own city council. They pass laws, but Congress has 30 days to override those laws if they don't like what the city's done. So we're not totally independent. But D.C., we passed by voter initiative, marijuana legalization initiative a couple of years ago. In the District of Columbia, you are allowed to possess up to 2 ounces of marijuana. You're allowed to grow up to, I think it's 6 plants, not more than 3 can be mature at any one time. And you're even allowed to give an ounce to another adult. No remuneration. You can't sell it, but you can give it to a friend or whatever. So we have actually pretty fine marijuana laws. They're not perfect. Because of a rider Congress has put on our budget here, they will not allow the district to establish recreational dispensaries. Otherwise, our city council's ready to do it. We do have 5 or 6 medical dispensaries. So the point I want to make is, you're right, there is a major marijuana exposition here in the nation's capital this week, but every day when the members of Congress drive to work, they're driving past dispensaries. They're in a city where if you're stopped with 2 ounces of marijuana, they can't even confiscate it. It's not contraband. It's perfectly legal. So it's a strange world, because locally we have very progressive government, but of course federally we don't.
Wow. Keith, where can people go to check you out, to check out what you do NORML?
Well, like everyone, we mostly deal with the internet now. So just go to NORML.org. NORML is an acronym, N-O-R, M as in Mary, L.org. We're a nonprofit. And you'll find more information than you know what to do with. We'd love to have your support. Sign up for our free email list so that when we have a bill pending in your state, we can let you know what you need to do to support it. And otherwise, I would say this, if you can, come out of the closet. If you're a marijuana smoker, we need to overcome the negative stereotype that too many Americans still have of marijuana smokers. It's sort of Cheech and Chong stuff. But the reality is most marijuana smokers are just average Americans who work hard and raise families and contribute to their communities. But when they relax in the evening, they prefer to smoke a marijuana cigarette, while other Americans may prefer a beer or a glass of wine. So if the one thing every smoker can do, assuming, I don't want you to do it and lose your job, but assuming your circumstances allow it, is make sure that your family and friends and neighbors know that you're an occasional marijuana smoker. You're still a responsible individual. We need to overcome the negative stereotype that still persists.
Keith, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Michelle.
Keith Stroup, Washington, D.C.-based attorney and founder of NORML. For the Cannabis Innovators Show, I'm Michelle Holliday on PortfolioWealthGlobal.com. This is a great interview for anyone looking for a historical perspective on how, why, and when marijuana and all of its benefits and uses was made illegal in the 1930s. Growing up, we always seem to have an innocent notion that our governments can do no wrong, and that all politicians are smart people working on our behalf. But under closer examination, sometimes we come to realize that important decisions have been made using egotistical judgment. This just goes to show us all that we must always do our own research. What is most important is that the level of consumer protection will be elevated from legalizing the market. Proper labeling, laboratory checks, quality control, pricing, and transparency. Doing away with a black market is truly important. When asked why the legalization process took so long to be where it is today, Keith replied with an astonishing fact that 40 years ago, only 12% of the population were in favor, as opposed to close to 60% today, with 90% of our population already in favor of medicinal use. The opportunity is amazing, and we summarized many of the key components on portfoliowealthglobal.com/cannabis pioneers. As Keith mentioned, California alone is predicted to double the market size of the entire industry. This is a flood that is about to burst, and we are at the forefront. Thanks so much for tuning in today. We'll see you again next time on the Cannabis Innovators Show. Until then, I'm Michelle Holliday at portfoliowealthglobal.com.